You can spend your whole life believing you're in control until the silent moment when you realize you never were. That's the initial shock. Not a dramatic collapse, not a belated confession, but an almost imperceptible crack in the certainty of who you think you are. Alan Watts would say that this is the first glimpse of truth, the moment when the ego stumbles over its own illusion and, for a second, is speechless. Modern man learns early on to transform encounters into strategies. He calls this maturity, emotional intelligence, autonomy. He observes, calculates, anticipates. He doesn't surrender to the flow, he tries to manage it. As if love were an external mechanism, something that happens outside of him, something that needs to be carefully guided so as not to get out of control. But control, as Watts so often provoked, is merely the elegant name we give to the fear of feeling. There is a constant tension behind this posture, a silent effort to keep his identity intact, to avoid being surprised by his own vulnerability. The man believes he is playing with time, with distance, with the desire of the other. What he doesn't realize is that the real game takes place within him. Every rule he creates, every calculated step, is an attempt to sustain the fiction of a separate, solid, invulnerable self. And then comes the question that is rarely asked aloud. What exactly is being protected? Freedom or the image of someone who needs no one? Watts would point out, with serene irony, that this much-defended self is merely a pattern of thoughts repeating itself, a story told to avoid hearing the silence behind it. Silence is frightening, because in it there are no guarantees, only presence. At this stage, man still believes that to love is to lose something, to lose autonomy, lose power, to lose options. He doesn't realize that he is already losing contact with the direct experience of life, with the simple wonder of being alive in the presence of another human being. He confuses detachment with distancing, freedom with escape, and the more he tries to protect himself, the further he moves away from what he secretly desires, to feel whole. Watts used to say that the problem isn't fear, but the attempt to escape it. Ego builds complex systems to avoid being traversed by experience. But every construction based on resistance carries within it the germ of collapse. Not through failure, but by nature, nothing that tries to contain the flow of life remains intact for long. This is where the story truly begins. Not when the man meets the woman, but when the belief in control begins to waver. When an uncomfortable, almost imperceptible feeling arises that perhaps all this effort is unnecessary, perhaps even useless. Something stirs beneath the surface, still formless, still nameless. A gentle yet persistent restlessness. And the question echoes, even if he tries to ignore it. What if love is not something to be mastered, but something before which one learns to stop? This is the threshold, the exact point before the game collapses. The moment when the ego still believes it can retreat, but already senses that something inevitable is approaching. Because when life decides to be lived, no strategy is enough to stop it. He doesn't notice it at first. He almost never notices. Change doesn't come with clear signs, nor decisive dialogues, nor calculated gestures. It happens in the intervals, the moments when nothing seems to be happening. Alan Watts would say that this is how reality manifests itself, when the mind, bored by having nothing to control, relaxes its vigilance. She's there, but not for him. She's sitting at a cafe table looking out the window, distractedly stirring her spoon, observing the street as if expecting nothing. Or she's on the sofa, engrossed in something simple, a book, a random series, a distant thought. She's not performing a presence. She's not trying to occupy space. She simply exists, with an almost disconcerting naturalness. The man observes without knowing exactly why. There is no urgency, no obvious excitement. It's something else, something more subtle. He feels a slight internal disorganization, as if the usual rhythm of his thoughts has been interrupted. Strategic questions don't arise. There is no calculation, There is no anticipation, just a strange silence that begins to expand. Watts would call this non-doing, not in the sense of inertia, but of absence of interference. She is not trying to control the situation, and that is precisely what disarms the game. The man's ego, accustomed to reacting, finds no stimulus. There is no tension to manage, nor signals to interpret. The mind, without a task, begins to observe. It is at this point that something unexpected happens. He finds himself noticing details that had never been part of his criteria. The way she moves without haste, the way she gets lost in thought, the tranquility of not needing to be noticed all the time. It's not immediate infatuation, silent, almost bodily recognition, as if something ancient within him responded before thought could formulate any explanation. The scene is banal, almost invisible to outsiders. It could happen in an ordinary kitchen, while she makes coffee without saying a word, or in an overly bright room, while she laughs to herself at something he doesn't understand. There's no direct exchange, no validation, and yet something shifts profoundly. Watts insisted that reality doesn't shout, it whispers. And what man begins to hear is a gentle, yet persistent discomfort, the feeling that all his defenses may be meaningless there. He doesn't feel threatened, he doesn't feel invaded, he feels something more unsettling, effortless security. And this confuses him, because he always believed that security required control. Then an internal shift occurs. Not a decision, but a doubt. Why does this seem so different? Why does this simple presence have more impact than any explicit attempt at seduction he has ever experienced? He tries to rationalize, but the explanation doesn't come. His thoughts slip, logic doesn't hold up. Only direct experience remains. At that moment, without realizing it, he stops placing himself at the center. Not as a sacrifice, but as a relief. It's as if the weight of sustaining a carefully constructed identity has been suspended for a few seconds. Watts would say it's the ego resting from itself, a brief return to the natural flow where nothing needs to be proven. The mystery isn't in her. It's in the effect she creates by not trying to create anything. That begins to generate a new, silent, almost imperceptible tension. If he's not playing, then who is he in this space? Question doesn't form in words, but reverberates in the body. Doesn't know it yet, but he's already crossed a point of no return. Because once you experience effortless presence, everything else starts to seem excessive, artificial, noisy, and the ego, even without admitting it, senses that its authority is about to be questioned. There comes a point when a man begins to feel discomfort, not because of what is happening, but because of what is ceasing to happen. Automatic responses no longer arise. The rules he used to follow seem distant, almost childish. He still moves, still talks, still laughs, but something essential no longer works as before. The mask is in place, but it weighs him down. Alan Watts would say that this is the moment when the ego begins to perceive its own artificiality, like an actor who, in the middle of a play, forgets why he is playing that role. Fear, until now well organized, begins to lose its form. It's not the classic fear of rejection or abandonment. It's something more subtle and deeper. The fear of being pierced, of being seen without filters, of realizing that behind the carefully constructed identity, there is no fixed center, only movement. Man has always believed he needed to protect himself so as not to get lost. But now a disturbing suspicion arises. What if he had never been as distant from you as when he protected himself? The ego tries to react. It reactivates old narratives, recalls past relationships, mistakes, internal promises made never to feel that way again. But these stories no longer have the same weight. They sound repetitive, worn out, like explanations that no longer convince even those who tell them, and a question begins to press from within. Still without clear language, who am I when I'm not trying to defend myself? the man begins to notice something unsettling. He has always confused freedom with the absence of attachment. He called independence what, in practice, was merely avoidance. Alan Watts used to point out this trap with surgical precision, the attachment to non-attachment, fear of needing someone disguised as spiritual virtue or emotional maturity. Now, this logic is beginning to crumble silently. He observes how he always felt proud of not caring too much, of not creating expectations, keeping doors open. But, looking honestly, he realizes the hidden cost of that. The emotional superficiality, the constant feeling of just passing through his own life. Nothing held him back, it's true, but nothing touched him deeply either. Question arises that cuts through the flow of thoughts like a clean blade. What exactly was he gaining by never allowing himself to stay? What's most disturbing is that she doesn't demand any of that. She doesn't ask for surrender. She doesn't pressure. She doesn't invade. She doesn't try to breach his defenses. She simply doesn't recognize them as necessary. This completely disarms the narrative of danger. Because whenever man has prepared for love, it has been to resist it, not to embrace it. Now there is no attack. There is no threat. Only closeness, without intention. In this void of conflict, the ego is exposed. Without an enemy, without a strategy, without a clear role. And that's where the real fear is revealed. Not the fear of losing someone, but the fear of losing one's own image. Of admitting that all that emotional architecture may have been built to sustain an identity that never needed to exist. Alan Watts would say that this is the point where the ego feels its own impermanence. The final question doesn't come as a thought, but as a physical sensation, almost a tightness in the chest. If I stop protecting myself now, what's left? It's not a comfortable question. It doesn't offer an immediate answer, but it marks a definitive break. Because once formulated, even in silence, it's no longer possible to return to the innocence of the game. Something has been seen, something has been recognized, and what begins to unravel is not the bond with her, but the belief that love was the real risk. There's a curious, almost ironic moment when a man realizes all his emotional training has been useless. He's read books, listened to advice, accumulated theories about attraction, timing, and control. He's learned when to speak, when to be silent, when to withdraw to appear desirable. And yet, none of that prepared him for what's happening now. The sudden irrelevance of all those strategies. Alan Watts used to say that humans are the only animals that stumble when trying to walk, precisely because they think too much about their own movement. Love begins to reveal this same irony. There are almost identical accounts among very different men. An executive accustomed to negotiating complex contracts realizes he can't negotiate what he feels when he sees her fall asleep on the sofa. A man who always kept several possibilities open notices, with almost scientific surprise, that he has stopped noticing other women effortlessly. Not out of morality, not out of promise, but out of simple, spontaneous disinterest. The mind, which previously scanned the environment for options, now rests. Watts would call this a return to the natural state, when desire ceases to be compulsion and becomes clarity. Studies on behavior confirm something even more disturbing for the ego. The more we try to control human relationships, the greater the anxiety and the lower the satisfaction. People who operate relationships like projects exhibit higher levels of emotional vigilance and a lower sense of belonging. But man doesn't need data to feel this. He feels it in his body. An old weariness begins to emerge, as if he had sustained an invisible tension for years. And then he realizes something improbable. Quitting the game doesn't weaken him. It relieves him. What's unexpected is that this change isn't accompanied by euphoria. There are no fireworks, no impulsive declarations. There is silence. A comfortable silence, which would have previously seemed boring, finds himself listening with genuine, not strategic, attention. Laughs without thinking about the effect of the laughter. is present without calculating the emotional cost of it. Watts would say that the ego isn't being defeated, but set aside, like a tool that has fulfilled its function and can now rest. There's an almost imperceptible shift when a man understands he no longer needs to defend himself. He notices he's not being invaded, absorbed, or diminished. On the contrary, he feels more whole. The old belief that love requires loss begins to seem strange, like an inherited superstition. He remembers how many times he distanced himself when everything was going well, just to preserve an abstract sense of control. Now, that impulse doesn't arise, and that surprises him. The most improbable event is this: he stops thinking of the future as a threat. Plans previously avoided emerge effortlessly, not as emotional contracts, but as natural images. A repeated coffee, a shared routine, a tomorrow that doesn't need to be guaranteed to be desired. The ego observes this with distrust, but no longer commands. Watts asserted that true security lies not in predicting, but in trusting the process. Man finally begins to understand what this means. Nothing was achieved, nothing was formally decided, and yet something ends here. The belief that love needs to be controlled in order not to hurt. The game loses its meaning not because it failed, but because it was overcome. What lies ahead is neither risk nor promise. It is continuity, and that, for someone who has always lived in escape mode, is the most unexpected of revelations. Surrender doesn't happen in a solemn way. There's no promise, no definitive declaration, no clear moment that can be pointed to as the beginning. What exists is a sequence of small, almost imperceptible internal breakdowns that accumulate until the old structure simply can no longer hold. Alan Watts said that true change occurs when we stop trying to change. That's exactly what's starting to happen here. The man still tries, instinctively, to regain some control. He observes his own surrender with distrust, like someone stepping onto a frozen lake without knowing if the ice will support the weight. On certain days, the fear returns. The mind whispers that this is dangerous, that feeling this way always comes at a high price. Old memories emerge, stories of loss, of disappointment, of broken promises. The body reacts, the chest tightens, and for a moment he considers retreating. Something has changed. Unlike before, fear no longer rules alone. He realizes he can feel it without obeying it. Watts explained that suffering doesn't arise from emotion, but from resistance to it. By not fighting fear, man notices that it loses power. What remains is an unexpected clarity. Fleeing now would be more painful than staying. A real point of tension then arises. He understands that if he continues, there will be no return to his former emotional neutrality. The options that once served as a safety net are beginning to disappear, not because they have been cut off, but because they have ceased to make sense. That is frightening. Freedom, as he knew it, was linked to the possibility of escape. Now, he finds himself choosing to remain, and that choice weighs heavily on him. The turning point comes when he realizes he's not giving up on himself. On the contrary, he's letting go of a persona he's been maintaining for years. It's not about needing her to feel complete, but about recognizing that life expands when it's not contained. Watts would call this trusting the flow. The understanding that controlling too much is a form of distrust in one's own existence. There is a decisive, silent moment when a man accepts his own vulnerability without trying to justify it, doesn't turn it into discourse nor into a promise, simply allows it to exist, and, in that space, something reorganizes itself. The tension that previously came from the fear of losing now gives way to another, deeper feeling, the willingness to care, not out of obligation, but out of natural affinity. This acceptance changes the rhythm of everything. Time seems to slow down when they are together. Conversations stretch effortlessly. Silences cease to be awkward. He begins to realize that he is more attentive, more present, less fragmented. His mind, previously always focused on the next step, now rests in the present. It's not ecstasy, it's stability, and that surprises him even more. The anticipation of what comes next becomes inevitable. He knows he has crossed a threshold. He also knows that loving like this offers no guarantees. But, for the first time, this absence of guarantees doesn't sound like a threat. It sounds like life in its purest form. The risk remains, but it no longer paralyzes. And while the ego observes in silence, the man understands that surrender has not weakened him. It has prepared him for something greater than control could ever offer. When everything quiets down, man realizes he hasn't arrived at a new destination. He has arrived at an old, forgotten, a profoundly familiar state. Alan Watts said that life is not a journey with an endpoint, but a continuous dance. To love, in this sense, is neither to conquer nor to lose, but to consciously participate in the movement. What has changed is not the world around him, but the way he has come to inhabit it. The great revelation is simple and, for that very reason, difficult to accept. Nothing needed to be forced. Love didn't demand better versions, nor more refined strategies, nor more intelligent defenses. It only demanded presence, to truly be there, to listen without preparing a response, to feel without trying to correct the emotion, to allow the other to exist without being transformed into a project or a threat. This is the lesson that runs throughout the entire journey and can be applied to any relationship, not just a romantic one. In practice, this begins with something small and concrete, noticing when you are acting instead of being, recognizing the impulse to control, to anticipate, to protect yourself even before there is real danger, and in those moments, doing the opposite of what habit dictates. Stay, breathe, listen, not to expose yourself recklessly, but to test reality beyond fear. Watts taught that confidence is not born from certainty, but from the willingness to experiment. Loving like this doesn't mean giving up boundaries or accepting just anything. It means recognizing the difference between healthy boundaries and walls built out of fear. A boundary protects life. A wall prevents it from circulating. When you learn to distinguish one from the other, your relationships change in nature. They cease to be silent battlefields and become spaces of real exchange where two whole people choose to walk together. Perhaps you're in a relationship right now and realize you've been hiding more than showing yourself. Maybe you're alone and tired of repeating patterns that always seem to lead to the same place. In both cases, the invitation is the same. Stop trying to win love. Start listening to it. Observe how you distance yourself when something starts to matter. Pay attention to the stories you tell yourself to justify the distance. And, little by little, try being a little more present than usual. Transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's built in everyday life, seemingly small choices. Turning off the phone during a conversation, and not running away from silence. Saying what you feel without dramatizing, without manipulating, without testing. Each of these gestures weakens the defensive ego and strengthens something more stable. Self-confidence to feel, to love, and to move forward whole, no matter what happens. If this reflection resonated with you on any level, don't let it get lost as just another interesting thought. Put it into practice. Observe yourself. Experiment. Allow yourself to live with a little less control and a little more truth. And if you wish, share your experience in the comments, even anonymously. Liking the video helps this message reach more people, and subscribing to the channel keeps this space alive so we can continue exploring topics that truly matter together. The next step isn't about learning more, it's about living better.